Hey everybody, welcome to the live challenge wrap up. Can you believe it's been 6 weeks? I certainly can't. I feel like it has flown by. When I think about this challenge and I kind of think of all the stuff that we've went over, it's kind of been in the works for a while. And so when it launched, I feel like it was just a crazy experience from then on out. So I'm really excited that we made it to this point and that we are going to be kind of wrapping up the challenge. Of course, not the last challenge ever, but definitely this kind of series of videos. So what I want to talk about was my thoughts of the challenge and my main things that I was trying to get through with some of the designs. So we're going to have a recap of some of the things that we've learned over these last 6 weeks, and then I'm going to answer your questions and then wish you very happy holidays and maybe give some hints as to when I'll be back with another challenge. First of all, 6 weeks, I was kind of nervous about this challenge because I wasn't sure how it would go over. It wasn't about a specific design or a specific area of the quilt, but how to quilt something is the number one question I'm asked. And so I knew that it would be something that was needed, but I didn't know how I could make that come through with the designs. Throughout the challenge, I tried to pick designs that were fairly basic in how they go together, but could be used in a lot of different ways to create a lot of different effects. And so let's have a little recap and go over some of those things, and then I'll come back and answer your questions. So, all right. So first of all, we talked a lot about framing, right? So when you're looking at your quilts, we talked so much about showing off that main element. And if nothing else, if we can just get that, through your mind, I think that's really going to make everything a lot easier for you when it comes to actually picking out designs. We started with the 9-patch blocks, but this is the first one I'm going to show right here because it has the framing element so obvious, right? So we have the main thing in the center, and then we're framing it with something, I say basic, but what I mean is it's not so complex in how it goes together. When I'm looking at framing or I'm wanting to show off something, I want it to be fairly consistent. The consistent spacing means that it won't draw your attention to that area. So in the center of the block, the spacing is consistent between the designs, but I have that backtracking, I have that interest with those snowflakes or those stars. However, in the border design, the spacing is consistent, right? Hopefully, one square doesn't show up more than the other. And so when I'm talking about framing an element, that's really kind of what I'm getting at. Now, there were some designs that we haven't, that didn't make it into the challenge, but there will be bonus videos. So all these I have videos for. I just have to sit down and edit them all. But when it comes to framings, a lot of the time it's echoing. So when I'm working around the center part of the block, and I want to show off whatever that is in the center, I can use echoing and even a different design to do it. So even though before in the boxy design we were using the consistent spacing to frame it, here we're using that unquilted area just to kind of give it a little bit of an extra framing element. This is something I do a lot, especially when I was quilting for customer quilts. Adding a little echo line and then filling in just makes it look a little bit more custom, and it really doesn't take that much longer if you're comfortable with it. So when we talk about framing, it doesn't have to be just echoing. It doesn't have to be just those boxy designs. It can be a lot of different things. It can also be something a little bit more basic. So in this particular one, I use just straight lines, just those straight echo lines to echo the sides to frame the center piece. If everything on your block is quilted crazy over the top, nothing's really going to stand out, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if I'm wanting to show off the most important thing, maybe it's this fabric, maybe it's the design, then I want to use that echoing and that framing to help accomplish that. And I think once quilters can kind of wrap their mind around that, there's like 3 main things, but that's one of them. If you can think about what do I want to show off and how can I do it, it doesn't have to be complex or over the top. Just use those echoing or those consistent spacing to achieve that effect. Now, here we did echoing of the center where we did that little square spiral design. So again, more straight lines. Again, I'm getting that echo effect. It's just a little different. And this is just going to help bring attention to that area by separating it with those straight lines. Of course, if you remember when we went through this particular design, you could mark those spaces out, those 1-inch gaps Or you can just eyeball it, knowing that really the emphasis is going to be on that center where that dense quilting is. And once I have that main element, then I can make it, pretty easy in the rest of it. So in the star points, more echo lines. Don't make every part of the block so difficult to choose. Just kind of think, what have I already been doing? What feels comfortable? And move on. And the good thing is, the more you do it, the more you're going to find what you like. So you just have to keep practicing with that. Now, our most recent video, the one that wrapped it up, has echoing. It has that framing effect, but we're using it slightly different in this instance, right? I'm using the points of the block as a guide. I'm using echoing to really highlight that shape, and I'm using a little bit of texture with the wishbone. And so the thing to remember is, if you can figure out what that one thing is, then you can start picking designs to go around that. Now, this particular design itself, if you notice, it kind of runs right through that larger triangle. It kind of ignores that piecing. So this is not something I would do if this was one of my favorite fabrics in the quilt, or if this was some element of a bigger design. In this particular instance, I love the squares, and that's what I'm wanting to show off. What do you do, though, if there's multiple things about the quilt that you love or the block that you want to show off? Well, you kind of have to pick or choose and maybe do a little bit of both. So if I loved this diagonal effect, but I also really love these triangles, maybe these lines would just be in the white, or maybe I would do something different in this area, in the green triangle. So, it doesn't have to be so extreme one way or the other. You can really kind of pick and choose to make it kind of fit your preferences as far as that goes. All right, so we talked about echoing in the half square or the X blocks, and honestly, this is one of my favorites because it's so basic in how it goes together. I'm just echoing the side of the block, but I'm not echoing the side that we would think, right? I'm not echoing that X, I'm echoing the top and the bottom block. But what really makes this design work is the variation between the spacing, right? So these segments are about 1 inch apart, and then the space between them is about 1/4 of an inch. That variation allows this to stand out, so it doesn't just look like straight lines, you get this kind of secondary effect. Now, okay, you have been hopefully watching a few of my videos. You know my personality by now. I'm easily amused, and I love this. Now, I will say that when I'm picking designs, I don't think it has to be super difficult to be impactful. Surely you've seen that as well. So I know there was a little bit of chatter like, oh, it's kind of basic. Is this a little lazy? I would say anybody that's quilted with a ruler knows it's not really lazy because it takes a little bit longer. But I don't think it has to be over the top or difficult. And I will say that's something I struggle with when I'm picking out designs. When I was thinking about teaching this, I'm thinking, oh, how am I going to talk about this enough to make it interesting and make it, resonate? And hopefully I did a good enough job on that. But it does not have to be so difficult. And we're going to kind of hit on some designs we saw a lot through this challenge. But just know that we don't have to know, you don't have to know 25 million different designs. You get to just learn a few, and you can use them in a lot of different ways. Okay, so we're still talking about those echoing, again, making those secondary patterns come out. And here we're not even using the outside of the blocks. We're creating those effects that we want to have come out. So this again was another one that I loved. I found it super amusing to kind of turn that 9 patch into a different shape. And this is going to be something I would do in a much bigger block. The easier it is to piece a quilt block sometimes, the more difficult it is to quilt it, right? Because you have this big area. Now you can use the quilting to break it down. And I'm using the echoing on the outsides just to kind of flatten that area. Now I did a little bit of straight line quilting within this video, but it doesn't have to be done with a ruler. It could be done with, back and forth lines, anything that's nice and consistent. So I just kept it kind of basic on the outside, but you could definitely switch that up and do some different things. So talking about framing still, because that's, one of the biggest takeaways here, I'm framing it with quilting and other designs. So I'm taking the same idea that we did in that 9 patch, and I'm just putting it in the pinwheel, except I'm using the piecing of the block as a guide. So by adding that extra echo line, by switching it up, it just makes it easier to manage for those larger blocks. and also adds a little bit more detail and interest. So you really can have a lot of fun with this technique, doing a lot of different kind of things with it. All right, we also talked a little bit about how to move on, right? How do you go from one block to the next? I think it's much like any creative endeavor, right? You learn the design and then you learn how to apply it to the area. And when you're working with a design that's repetitive, like flying geese could be, that are all in a row, kind of like that, it's going to definitely be helpful if you can think how I need to move on. So it's interesting when I talk to people and I'm giving them advice on how to quilt their quilts, when I say things like, well, how do you imagine that this looks like? Or what do you see this block as? Because it's different for everybody. But no matter how you see the block, you still have to progress from one to the next. Now, I always try to be careful because when I'm teaching a class or doing a video, I'll say something like, just travel or just move around. There's nothing wrong with breaking thread to move to a different section. That's not it at all. Don't feel like you can't break thread. You definitely can tie off and start a new line of quilting. The problem is I'm just so easily distracted that I like to keep going as much as I can without having to stop. It just kind of keeps me in that focus and in that flow. And when we did the flying geese, we talked a lot about like, okay, in this first triangle, I want to end on the opposite side. But in the pink one, I want to come back to where I started. And so when I'm picking designs, after I've picked the most important thing, then I'm thinking, all right, how do I work my way around this? And then I pick the designs that are going to do that. And so I think when you can kind of think through the next couple steps, sometimes it'll make it a little easier. Of course, there are times where the quilting isn't efficient, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be efficient all the time. It just depends on how much time you have and, how much you love the person you're doing it for. Something I talked about just a little bit, not a whole lot, in this particular one is texture, right? So in earlier challenges, especially the borders challenge, we saw this, the swirls. When I talk about texture, it's one of those kind of buzzwords for quilters, right? I love the texture of quilting. When we're talking about texture, we just mean that no one single part of the design stands out from the rest. And so if I want it to have a nice, consistent overall look, like a filler or like a wavy line design, that's going to help. That consistent texture is going to help. And sometimes I want to give a block a nice texture if it's a beautiful fabric and I just don't want the quilting to take away from it. If it's a part of the quilt that I just want to have it quilted, but not to be the main element. So this is kind of like the background, the filler. This is the areas that I love, but they're not the shining star in general. Okay, so we talked a lot about continuous curve, and we didn't see this particular one in the challenge. This one I left off of there because I knew we had already touched on continuous curve a lot. I could have done continuous curve in every single video. That's how versatile it is. So when I'm looking at my block, I'm thinking, how do I work my way around? And continuous curve is just a really easy way to get from one place to the other. So when in doubt, quilt continuous curve in the area. That's usually the best suggestion. But what's great about it is you can add more or less of those arcs to make it more dense or less dense. It really doesn't matter. Just depends on your preferences. But one thing I want to point out, and I don't think you should ever point out your mistakes. That's not what you should do, but this is my job, so that's what I do. Not that I think it's a mistake, but I'm not worried about where these arcs overlap. And I'm sure that's something you probably heard me say a lot in the videos, and actually I edit out about half the times I say it, because I say it a lot. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. But what I'm focused more on is trying to get those lines to end somewhat near the corner and somewhat close to the points. If they land close to the points, it's going to look pretty good. And when you step back, you're just going to see that overall effect. So don't get too caught up on that part of it, because honestly, when you're done, you just have this nice effect. But for the most part, if I'm going to try to focus on one area, it's going to be on the corners. It's going to be on those points, and I'm going to try to make that happen. Now, this is another one we didn't see in the challenge. I showed it during one of the live check-ins, but I wanted to show you that when you're framing that element, you can make it as complex or as easy as you want. And I would think maybe if you just came across this, you might think, oh, look how beautiful that is. I mean, that's what I think you're thinking in my head. But if you look at the basic shapes, It's nothing that we haven't already seen a lot. It's a couple diagonal lines, it's some continuous curve, it's just a little bit more of them, right? So when you're quilting or you see something and you think, oh, I could never do that, well, when you start looking at the basic shape, I bet you've probably seen it before and you probably could do it. So when you're framing whatever element it is, definitely keep adding lines. Now, what's the benefit of that? The benefit is if some of these lines don't look really good or straight or what have you, I could just keep adding lines until you don't see them anymore. And when I'm teaching and talking, I don't think I'm a better quilter than anybody else. I just think I'm much, much better at hiding my mistakes. I'm really good at, rationalizing them away. And again, some more of those dot-to-dot lines, really drawing attention to the center, creating that secondary design in the outer ring. This is something, again, I do a lot on quilts. And adding more or less lines, really just depending on, how much space I have or what I'm doing or what's going on. Sometimes I don't know what I'm going to do the next block, so I just hang out at that block for a while. It really just depends. This is the same kind of idea, just with some different filler. And so, just connecting those points, looking to the block for inspiration will really, really help. Connecting the outer corners to the corner of the inside block, that's something I do a lot. A lot of these are variations of that, but it's a really cool way to take something that might be a little bit more basically pieced and really kind of highlight it with that different look. Again, with the echoing in the center to separate that filler. Okay, we also talked about motifs. So we heard of that in a couple of the videos. So a motif is just when you take a simple shape and great way to combine blocks. So if I look at this star and I see it as one whole star, not a center and a different outer ring, the quilting is going to help kind of give it that effect. Again, it just depends on what you see when you look at your block. Okay, another idea here, we saw some different textures and motifs in that star. Here, I tried a couple different variations just to give you some examples, but I don't think it looks bad. You don't have to stick with the same thing if it's not working, right? We'll just ignore that. If something's not working, just switch to something else. And so throughout this particular example, I wanted to show you how you could take a design, if you're struggling with it, how you can change it and make it easier for yourself. When something is difficult, you really have two choices, right? You can lean in and figure it out, or you can avoid it. And honestly, I don't think it's always bad. I don't like binding, so I avoid it. I don't particularly love applique, so I'm not leaning into it. But if you want to get better at something, like machine quilting, then you can lean into it and say, what can I do to make this easier for me? How can I change this design up so that it's not so difficult? So something to think of. And so we did see motifs a lot. So anytime we have a block with multiple shapes, oriented around the center, a motif is going to work. So we saw it in the stars. Here's the X blocks with that geometric design, adding more lines if you have more space, or just stopping at one row if you wanted. And again, switching it up with some different designs. So again, there's that continuous curve. We talked about how to extend the ruler a little bit to make it fit those tricky places, and changing up the different effects. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. You might not ever really know what you're going to get. And then again, more motifs, but using the quilting, there's those straight lines, right, that we saw back in week 1 to kind of emphasize that shape, just to kind of make that little pinwheel come out. Again, I'm so easily amused, but I just loved that. That was too fun. This is one that will be in a bonus video eventually, but this just shows that same idea of breaking up that pinwheel into a smaller block and adding the different element in the background. And here I just did some straight lines. I ended up showing the other version because I felt like there was a lot of straight lines already, and I wanted to incorporate some curviness for any of those that don't like geometric shapes. This is another one that didn't make it into the challenge, but it will be a bonus video. When you look at any design and you decide, or any block, and you decide where do you want to pull attention to, right? I need to bring the lines. I want all the quilting to come to that area, because that change of density, that, more dense quilting is going to help draw your eye to that area. So here, I'm just using those wedges, which we've already seen, to draw the eye to that center. But it doesn't have to be straight lines, right? So if you see something out online or out at a quilt show and you kind of like the effect, but you don't love the design that makes it up, you can switch it out. And here I did the same thing with that wavy design that we saw in the flying geese blocks, more continuous curve that we also saw in the flying geese blocks, and it's still pulling all the attention to the center there. Now, if I had actually pieced this block, there's a good chance that it would not look that pretty in the center, so I probably would have to do something different. But since I'm working on a panel and all those points just happen to come together nicely, then I'm going to show that off with the quilting. And then the last design that we learned this last week, again, grouping bigger areas. I was wondering, I didn't know how this would go over because this is something that's a little touchy, right? If a customer gives me their quilt and they've pieced this block with that white background, they might not like that effect. But you, if you're quilting your own quilts and you are the expert of your opinion and you know what you like, then I think this is a fun way to handle it. And what I think is really cool, and you can't see with this panel, if this were a repeating shape, this block was used over the whole quilt, you would get a really neat secondary design where they grouped together at the points or created that cool secondary effect. So don't be afraid to try and group different things and make it easier for you. And really throughout this whole challenge, I'm trying to reiterate that over and over again. Every time you try something, you figure it out. You figure out whether you like it or you don't like it. Sometimes knowing, do I like this effect? Or knowing that you don't like it is just as important. So when you know you don't like it, it's going to help you be successful with that. So again, we went through a lot of different designs that, even some of them I was like, ooh, I'll throw that in last minute. It was really kind of fun to work through those. So even though we're learning some basic shapes and we saw them several times throughout the challenge, I'm still really trying to teach a technique as well. So as you're watching the videos, or if you go back and rewatch them, hopefully you can start to pick up on, it's not just the design, there's a design and there's a technique or a application to an actual quilt. Because I've always said, it's one thing to know how to quilt a swirl, it's a totally different thing to know where to put it on a quilt and how to use it in those areas. So I hope that you have found the videos helpful and start breaking down the process. But you have to practice. That's the sad part of it all right there, right? I can give you the tips, but if you're not practicing, it's going to be an uphill battle. So just know that it just takes some practice. But as you get those, successes and the wins, and you feel like it looks good, it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and start answering some of your questions. Just reading through some of these. Usually I kind of pull some from other places to get me started. This is so good. So Sue says, how do you keep the slider from rolling up and quilting it to the quilt? Okay, first of all, I have done that a couple times. Even when filming the challenge, I'm quilting and I'm like, what is that sound? Oh, that's my mat getting quilted. If it's moving around, you can rinse it off and that will get the lint off the back. Let it dry and then it will stick back to it. Although I usually tape mine down. I get some washi tape and just tape it along the edges to keep it from moving. If it gets a little perforated, it's still going to work just fine. So don't feel like you can't, do that. Okay, so another thing was about the machines. So most of the videos were done on a sewing machine, demonstrated, for really two reasons. Most people have a sewing machine, so it's a little bit easier for most people to look at that and correlate it. It's a little bit easier to film as well because the camera just gets to stay in one place. Now, of course, it's kind of like right in front of me, but it still stays in one place. But all the designs have been quilted on a long arm, and I did record them all. I had grand plans, grand ideas of getting it all edited and out, but I'll be adding those. And so at any point, you can go to the website and you go to fmqchallenge.com. You can find the individual challenge, which is the Help How Do I Quilt It, and then on that page, I'll have the bonus videos all together, so you can kind of check through. It's also a great place to go find all the handouts for the previous episodes. So this is something I'm working through on the website. Pretty soon, all the older challenges all the information will be in one beautiful place for you. So just keep checking back there often and you can definitely find it. I will say when it comes to the sewing machine versus the long arm, the design still goes together the same. It's just the movement that's a little different. 80% of quilting is just knowing where you're going. So as long as you know the next couple steps, no matter what machine you're using, you'll be successful with it. The biggest difference, I think, between the two would be using the ruler. The ruler movement's a little different, but it's a lot of fun, and they both have benefits to it. I kind of like to joke that I'm bilingual because I can do both, and so it's a lot of fun to hop back and forth between those two. Okay, so could you help me with starting to do for FMQ? I just got my new foot, and I've tried it for a bit, but it's hard to know where to start. Well, the best thing to do if you're starting off brand new and you're like, I don't know what to do, I think you should get a piece of fabric or smaller, nothing too big. Get a piece of fabric that has a print on it, a big, beautiful flower, something that you can trace along. Because when you're learning how to machine quilt, you're learning two things, right? You're learning how to drive, how to move the fabric, and you're learning how to quilt the design. So that's very much like learning how to drive a car and navigate a new city at the same time. That sounds horrible, don't you think? Let me just drop my teenage son downtown Kansas City and let him figure out both. So when you have a piece of fabric with those lines marked on it, you're tracing the lines or you're quilting along the design of the fabric, you're learning how to drive, right? You're learning how to breathe, not pee your pants, how to move your hands. And then once you feel like, okay, I can do this while breathing and not peeing my pants, then you can start working on a design, right? And you pick a design that you want to learn and you just go for it. You practice it until it starts to become more refined. That's the best tip that I could give. Getting past that fear of messing up is difficult because, you're scared, you think, oh, this is difficult, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. And I promise there comes this point, anybody on there has watching can see when that point hits where you're not thinking about it anymore, it's the best. It's like meditation, it's great. I love it, love it, love it. So you could try that. See if that helps. But the most important thing is when you're quilting, don't worry about tension and don't worry about stitch length. Usually those two things kind of take care of themselves as you practice. So don't get too caught up with that. What's the best thread to sew with? So if you're talking piecing or sewing, I like cotton. A high quality cotton like Aurifil is really nice. Cotton has those little threads or the little plies that help it grab and make a nice tight seam. If I'm quilting, it just depends on the effect that I want to go with. If I want a cotton look or I like the blending in a little bit more, I'd go with cotton, but I like a little bit of sheen to my thread, so I'll go with glide or something that has a little bit of shine to it. It's all up to you, and it's all what you think looks good. So a good cotton for piecing, and then you can experiment with other threads. If you want one thread for piecing and quilting, Aurifil I think does it. So Aurifil is a great one for both of those. So you could definitely check those out. I love this. I'm not going to even try to pronounce the Dole class. There's I quilt by hand, but I've gotten so many interesting ideas to use on my quilts. Love that. I used to be a hand quilter. A lot of fun. There is something about that hand, but I haven't done it for a while. Let's see. Any other questions? Slim is a great ruler to start with if you want to try quilting with rulers. Slim has that straight edge. Any straight edge ruler, not just Slim. Any straight edge is great because the point of contact between the edge of the foot and the ruler is the same no matter where you are. So you don't have to think about going around those curves. I will say that having a ruler's challenge has been the #1 requested challenge. I've always kind of hesitated because I didn't want to have a series where you had to buy something, like where you would need to have rulers or what have you. But I think that's something you'll see in the first quarter of next year. So because so many people have so many questions about that. And I think once you feel comfortable free-motion quilting, being able to incorporate a ruler into that just opens up a lot of possibilities. And so I use both. Quilting with a ruler is free-motion quilting. I do it with and without the ruler. It's just a lot of fun. So you can have that. Let me see, any questions? I love that, Jackie. I love so much when you tell it like it is. It's funny because I've never been a perfectionist, probably obvious to you. So it kind of blows my mind sometimes when people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I didn't have to be perfect. And I'm like, wow, I'm glad I never felt like I had to be perfect because I would be in a lot of trouble. I mean, don't get me wrong. I have my own neuroses, definitely, but definitely not that one. So yeah, everybody, as you're quilting, I think sometimes, and I don't know what it is about free motion quilting in general that makes people so critical of themselves. It's so easy to like try it. I always see it in a class, somebody's trying, and I see them looking around, and then they're getting deflated, and then they're like, oh, I'll never be able to do this. And I'm thinking, we've all sucked. We have all sucked. And if you make a mistake, I guarantee you almost everybody's made it. And if they haven't, then they're going to. So it is what it is. I think we have enough stuff to worry about in life. I don't think quilting or machine quilting should be one of those. And so rulers, yeah, on a sewing machine and a long arm. I like them both. I use them both everywhere. Okay, so one last question. I like this one. It's perfect way to wrap this up. How would you quilt a log cabin? Okay, so knowing that question, Virgie, I love it. What do you think the first thing I'm going to ask you would be? What's the most important part of the log cabin? What do you like? Some log cabins are dark and light, and it makes a secondary effect. Is that the most important thing? Some log cabins are scrappy. Is it the fabric? Is it the square in the center, a different color, right? And so once you can identify that, then you can pick designs that will emphasize that. Now let's say it's that secondary design. And I know it's hard to imagine because I'm just thinking in my head and you can't see what's in my head. That's a really good thing, by the way. If it's because I like the dark and the light, they make two different designs, they make a secondary design, I'm gonna do two contrasting designs. So maybe in the lighter, I do straight lines, and in the darker, I do a feather or a swirl. So using that contrast to help show it off. I've done log cabins quilt for Tula that I did dot to dot quilting where it kind of made angles in the corners. The great thing about log cabin quilts is it's a grid. You have all these beautiful reference points. So maybe print out a picture or practice drawing a couple of different designs. I bet you'll find something that looks pretty cool. Sometimes when you have multiple possibilities, that makes it harder to pick as opposed to some where you're like, well, there's really only one way to do this, so I got to do it. Okay, so I know I was really hoping to have the next challenge ready to announce by now. I wanted to kind of get that out before Christmas because it's like the best Christmas present. But this challenge was so good, it really kept me hopping. And so I do have to take a moment, or I will say there will be a new challenge announcement soon, hopefully very, very soon. Just want to kind of get all my things lined up before we do that. So until then, I'll definitely still be posting some bonus videos, you can still be on Facebook sharing pictures of what you're doing. Of course, you don't have to, do this challenge now. You can do it at any point. This was, like I said in the beginning, this challenge I was a little nervous about because it's a little different, something I never really had even taught a class on before, how to quilt it. Done a couple lectures, but not a class. And I just want to say thank you to everybody that's watched the videos, that has liked them, that has told their friends, that has bought the kit, helped supported the challenge. It's been my most popular one by far. And I couldn't do it without, everybody watching, but I definitely couldn't do it without the help I have. So Feyre, who moderates the Facebook group for me, is amazing. She's on there making sure all the spam stuff doesn't come through. Because if it wasn't for her, you would be seeing a lot of stuff about Chinese products, I think, or whatever spam things come through. Also, I, come up with the content and I film it and I do all that, but I have such great help cutting kits, answering questions. So definitely to my whole crew, people that have answered questions and done all that things, they make it where I can do it and to do this. So super excited to come out with another challenge and to do the whole thing all over again. Feel free to, let me know if there's something that you want to see or something, that I could do a little different that I can change. No fair saying you don't like the sound of my voice. I can't change that. But, if there's something that would make it more beneficial. It's kind of crazy when I think about where this challenge has started, just a couple of videos, and now I'm like, we got to do the handouts, and we got to do all this stuff. And I love it. And I hope that you're finding it as resourceful or as a good resource for you. Okay, so thanks so much. I can't wait to be back soon with another challenge. I hope that you all have a happy rest of your December and that you enjoy the quilting process. And I will see you very, very soon. Happy quilting.